have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Julian Wong, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Sunday, December 28th, 2025 issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Odysseus' days of fear under Russian fire. Odessa, Ukraine. When she hears explosions, Tetiana Rybak does the only thing she can. She lies in her bed and waits. Miss Rybak cannot walk, cannot go to the shelter. Recently, she asked a social worker to tape over the windows of her apartment with festive red gift wrap, old military posters, and a version of the Lord's Prayer. That way, she no longer has to see the Russian drones flying past. For the past 2 weeks, Russia has focused its military might on pounding her hometown, Odessa, the large port in Ukraine, repeatedly hitting it with drones and missiles in the city's worst shelling through almost 4 years of war. Miss Rybak has not had electricity for at least 9 days this month. For 4 of those, she had no heat and no water. A social worker needed to lug bottles of water to her, up 7 flights of stairs. Miss Rybak, who had been disabled for years, dressed in 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of warm pants, a sweater, and a thick terry cloth bathrobe. She then slid under 2 blankets. Psychologically, no one can withstand this anymore, said Miss Rybak, 64, sitting in her bed during a recent visit with social workers. My nervous system is completely shattered. Just last night, when the power went out and the shelling started, the air raid sirens, it was terrifyingly loud. But even more frightening was the blast wave. My doors and windows were shaking, thud, 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 and I was lying there, unable to run anywhere with nowhere to go. Ukrainians speculate that Moscow has been attacking Odessa, perched on the Black Sea, in retaliation for Ukraine's recent attacks on the Shadow Fleet that Russia uses to transport its oil and evade sanctions. While major Ukrainian cities commonly experience bursts of intense Russian bombardment, followed by quieter periods, Odessa has been under nearly constant attack since the early morning hours of December 12th. Russia has mostly targeted the city's ports and its power infrastructure. At least 9 people have been killed. With electricity, gas, and water out for days at a time, residents resort to charging their phones and computers at government relief centers or grocery stores, and to cooking their meals on makeshift stoves outside. They put plastic bags of milk, eggs, and sour cream on windowsills to keep them cold. Some have set up large generators in yards so neighbors can get power. One man attached clamps to his car battery and strung the cord to his apartment to power his refrigerator and his washing machine. One couple documented their date at a seafood restaurant to the Pop 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 soundtrack of air defense rifles targeting Russian drones. Dozens of Tesla drivers waited for hours at the only charging point that still worked. Ever since Russian troops invaded in February of 2022, Ukrainians have rallied. Their resilience has been so celebrated that it's almost a cliché. Alexei Kolidchuk, 83, said the power and heat outages were not a big deal for him. His biggest regret, he forgot to put his borscht outside in the cold, and it went sour well before it should have. He also said he wished he could give a message to President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia. Sometimes I think if I could go up to Putin with a stick, I'd give him a good knock on the head. Maybe it would knock some sense into him, because clearly something is very wrong there, Mr. Kolodchuk said. But after almost a week without power, some Odessa residents were running out of patience. They staged a protest. For some older people, dealing with these hardships just before Christmas and New Year's made optimism hard to find. The only thing that brings joy to Valentina Avdienko, 72, is her 3-year-old grandson, Denis. He is a cheerful chatterbox no matter what happens. Whenever the air raid alerts go off, he shouts, "Ballistics, ballistics," mimicking what he's heard adults say. Recently, she limped down the street in the dark toward her home, balancing on a cane in her left hand and a small shopping cart in her right. "I just want this madness to end," she said. "We are so tired. When will this finally be over?" For older people who remember life under the Soviet Union, this war is even more galling, pitting Ukrainians against the Russians they once considered brothers. For 25 years, Mahadan Farkiev, 73, served in the Soviet army with both Ukrainians and Russians. He fought in Afghanistan, where he was shot in his lower right leg. He keeps a photo of himself in uniform, his chest covered in Soviet medals, on a desk in his living room. But he no longer speaks to his brother or sister who live in Russia. Olha Demidova, 43, a social worker with Culture of Democracy, a Ukrainian charity, visited Mr. Farkiev recently to see what his family needed. He sat on his couch with his wife, Anastasia, and their son, Andriy, who is 42 and has cerebral palsy. He cannot talk or walk. He can only swallow mashed up food. His parents must change his diapers about 4 times a day. When the shelling is bad, Mr. Farkiev and his wife put Andriy in a commode chair with wheels and move into the hallway. Then their son clenches his hands into his fists and scrunches up his eyes until the explosions are over. Because God forbid, where would we run with him? Mr. Farkiev asked. Miss Demidova said that much of her job recently had been cheering up clients like Mr. Farkiev. Sometimes it's enough to just show up and ask them about their lives when they were younger. When there is no electricity, no heating, no water, a kind of apathy sets in, she said. You think that's it, it's the end. And then you realize no, absolutely not. You cannot give up. You have to keep going. You have to live through this, to endure it. It will get better. For Miss Rybeck, the woman confined to her bed in her 7th floor apartment, this was not the way things were supposed to go. She once cared for vulnerable people as a social worker herself, and once thought she was prepared for anything that could go wrong. But after having been disabled for years, she lost much of the use of her legs in 2023 after a difficult kidney surgery. She always thought her 3 sons, the oldest is 45, the twins 35, and her daughter could help her in her old age. She rarely sees her 3 sons, however. They are all fighting on the front lines, and last year, Miss Rybeck's daughter fled Ukraine because the stress had gotten to be too much. Miss Rybeck used to be able to sleep during air raid alarms, but she no longer can. The alarms sometimes last as long as 10 hours. All I want now is some kind of peace, even a small measure of it, she said. My health is simply collapsing. It feels like my strength is down to 0. There is no strength left. For Doge, big disruption returned meager savings. Largest claims were wrong, and real cuts were small, Times analysis finds. Washington. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency said it made more than 29,000 cuts to the federal government, slashing billion-dollar contracts, canceling thousands of grants, and pushing out civil servants. But the group did not do what Mr. Musk said it would: reduce federal spending by $1 trillion before October. On Doge's watch, federal spending did not go down at all. It went up. How is that possible? One big reason, according to a New York Times analysis: many of the largest savings that Doge claimed turned out to be wrong. And while the group did make thousands of smaller cuts, jolting foreign aid recipients, American small businesses, and local service providers, those amounted to little in the scale of the federal budget. In Doge's published list of canceled contracts and grants, for instance, the 13 largest were all incorrect. At the top were 2 Defense Department contracts, one for information technology, one for aircraft maintenance. Mr. Musk's group listed them as terminations and said their demise had saved taxpayers $7.9 billion. That was not true. The contracts are still alive and well, and those savings were an accounting mirage. Together, those 2 false entries were bigger than 25,000 of Doge's other claims combined. Of the 40 biggest claims on Doge's list, the Times found only 12 that appeared accurate, reflecting real reductions in what the government had committed to spend. The Times' analysis helps answer a basic question about Doge, which was hard to judge in the group's chaotic heyday, when it had enormous power to cut federal spending and force out government employees who stood in the way. At the time, in the early months of 2025, Doge listed real cuts alongside fake ones and made it hard to tell the difference. That raised the question of whether Doge, at its heart, was an exercise in budget cutting or in deception. It had elements of both, the Times found. But among Doge's largest claims, the bogus savings were both larger and much more common than the real ones. Similar errors and exaggerations recurred across the group's work. The Times analysis shows that, in trying to demonstrate progress toward its budget-cutting goal, Mr. Musk's group turned other promises inside out. Mr. Musk had said that Doge would be the most transparent organization in government ever, and that would bring the precision of the tech world to government. Instead, the group became opaque, with its lack of progress obscured by errors, redactions, and indecipherable accounting that few private businesses would accept. Some of Doge's employees are still working in the Trump administration, mainly on technology projects. But the group's budget cutting now seems to be spent, even as the fallout from fired federal workers and former grant recipients persists. The website where Doge tallied its successes, called the Wall of Receipts, has not been updated since October the 4th. At the White House, a spokesman declined to answer specific questions about Doge's work, instead sending a broad statement about the president's goals. President Trump pledged to cut the waste, fraud, and abuse in our bloated government. Neither Doge nor Mr. Musk, who left the group in May, responded to questions from the Times. In a podcast interview this month with Katie Miller, a former spokeswoman for Doge, Mr. Musk said his group had been somewhat successful at cutting spending. But he also said that if he could go back in time, he would not do it again. Instead of doing Doge, I would have basically built, worked on my companies, he said. To sort Doge's bogus cuts from its successes, the Times looked at federal records for the 40 largest items on the Wall of Receipts. In at least 28 cases, Doge got it wrong. Its errors included double counting, Doge took credit for canceling the same Department of Energy grant twice, adding $500 million in duplicate savings. Timeline errors. One contract that Doge claimed credit for ending had actually been terminated by the Biden administration, weeks before Doge began its work. 3 more items on Doge's list had simply expired. These were pandemic-era contracts with pharmacies that provided free COVID-19 testing for the uninsured. They were originally allowed to spend up to a combined $12.2 billion, but they never came close to that level. Then, in May, the 3 contracts ended on schedule. Doge still claimed credit for killing them, highlighting $6 billion in savings. Misclassifications. 7 programs that Doge claimed to have terminated are not dead, including 4 that were resurrected by court rulings. Exaggerations. In 16 cases, Doge greatly exaggerated its cuts. Many, including those 2 large Defense Department contracts, relied on an accounting trick that produced savings with little real-world effect. Doge lowered the official ceiling value of contracts, reducing the theoretical limit of what the government could eventually pay without changing its actual spending. Does lowering the maximum limit on your credit card save you any money? Said Travis Sharp, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, which studies federal spending. No, it does not. In one case, Doge made its claim particularly hard to check. It took credit for saving $312 million by canceling a United States agency for international development contract, but declined to identify which contract, citing continuing litigation. The Times used the few details given by Doge to identify the mystery item as a tech contract with the firm Accenture. Here, as well, Doge's claim was inflated by treating the ceiling value as if it were an IOU that the government had to pay in full, though it did not. Another case involved a 10-year-old Pentagon information technology contract with the firm CACI. Mr. Musk's group claimed it had reduced spending on this contract by $700 million, but again, it had only lowered the ceiling to $5 billion from $5.7 billion. This summer, CACI's chief executive, John Mengucci, told stock analysts that the change was meaningless. It doesn't change a thing for this company, he said. His company had always expected to be paid about $2 billion over the contract's lifespan. And even if the contract ever did reach the ceiling, he said, the Pentagon could just raise it again. There's no reduction of revenue, Mr. Mengucci said. A Pentagon spokesman defended these claims, saying contracts often did reach their ceiling values. But he also said money saved on one Pentagon contract could be shifted to higher priority investments, suggesting the goal was not necessarily to cut overall spending. Other errors on Doge's wall have been erased over time. On the day the list first appeared, the largest claim was an $8 billion Department of Homeland Security contract that was wrong by a factor of 1,000. The contract was only worth $8 million. That mistake and others were deleted after news reports revealed them. The power to cut the federal budget was never truly in Mr. Musk's hands. It belongs to Congress. And since the start of Doge's work, legislators have only once passed a law devoted to clawing back appropriated spending, defunding, foreign aid, and public broadcasting. In 2 mostly short-term spending bills, they have declined to make steep additional cuts. Mr. Musk's team, also did not confront the largest and growing components of the federal budget: healthcare, programs like Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the federal debt. You were listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Real cuts, real pain. Despite all that, the Doge effort led to some actual cuts that closed offices, canceled programs, and deprived people of food, medicine, and other aid. For people depending on those funds, the effects were sudden and devastating. Doge initially terminated nearly every contract and grant at the U.S. aid and sought to lay off most staff members, as Mr. Musk put the agency through the wood chipper. Some aid programs were later revived, but thousands were canceled. For Plan International USA, the cancellation ended work on 13 grants, including one that provided food aid in Ethiopia and an education program in Nepal to keep girls in middle school to avoid early, forced marriages. Its abrupt termination was listed on the wall as saving $11.7 million. When we left, a lot of parents could no longer afford to send their children to school, said Shana Marzili, the group's CEO. In Sudan, grant interruptions and cuts meant the aid group Alight had to pause offering food and medicine for refugees, though the group ultimately filled the gaps with private contributions. In other locations, including neighboring South Sudan, the organization stopped providing services altogether. Jocelyn Wyatt, the organization's chief executive, said private donors helped keep her group afloat this year. "I don't think it's sustainable," she said, "and I'm always impressed with the generosity." Scott Rome, the senior director for justice and accountability at the Center for Victims and Torture, said his group received its first stop work orders for its U.S. aid and State Department grants on Friday, January 24th. By the end of the next Monday, the organization had to stop paying 75% of its staff, which forced it to close centers that provided counseling and rehabilitation services to thousands. Mr. Rome said he was particularly concerned about possible suicides. Around a quarter of the torture victims the group served had recently experienced suicidal ideation. "We know for sure that survivors we are no longer able to serve are suffering," he said. Those dollar amounts were small compared with Doge's largest claims. That is, in effect, how Doge ultimately saved so little but still caused so much disruption. For small business and local communities, relatively modest sums had major effects. "It's the small numbers that hurt people," said Lisa Shea Munt, whose company, The Pulse of GovCon, tracks government contracts. The sheer volume of all of these cuts contributed to the sense that Doge was taking a fine-tooth comb to the government, no waste too small. But in reality, Doge needed the appearance of the big billion-dollar items because a vast majority of these claims added up to so little, at least in dollars. In total, the Trump administration terminated more contracts this year than the government did last year. But the actual dollars de-obligated, money the government had committed to spend but then pulled back, were at most a couple of $1 billion higher in 2025 than in recent years, according to contracting experts. For decades, the government has funded outside analysts to study whether taxpayer-funded programs actually work and how to improve them. It is the kind of work that would seem to serve Doge's mission of making government more efficient. But Doge canceled some of these contracts as well. "It doesn't feel like any of it has to do with efficiency," said LaDonna Pavetti, a senior fellow with MEF Associates. Her firm lost several contracts intended to help federal anti-poverty programs run more efficiently. Many of the errors Doge has left in its wall were rooted in the chaotic process of how it identified cuts, or told agencies to. Doge was staffed by outsiders from the business and tech worlds, without much experience in the arcana of government programs. The early approach to measure savings by subtracting spent money from ceiling values helped drive its choices at its high error rate. Dr. Sunny Patel, who was a top official at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, said he and his colleagues were given a dollar target and an Excel formula for calculating savings. Doge officials suggested contracts to cancel, and agency officials fought to protect ones they viewed as most critical by offering others instead. You had to hit the hard number, and there's only so many things that you can cut, he said. So it was like, oh, I guess we're going to offer this up because this is the least bad thing to do. In other cases, government workers came to understand Doge's process and fed the group nearly finished contracts with high ceiling values, rather than contracts that would significantly reduce spending. Many of Doge's initial broad cuts and layoffs were later put on hold or reversed by litigation, a fact Doge never went back to the wall to update. That litigation also cost the government money. The Port Discovery Children's Museum in Baltimore had won a $200,000 grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to fund a program in which museum staff members went into child care centers connected to public schools in Baltimore. There, they would teach parents how playing with their children could foster child development and family relationships. On April 28th, the government sent the museum a form letter terminating the grant and half its funds. The program no longer met agency priorities, the letter said, and no longer serves the interests of the United States. We were serving low-income families in Title I schools, said Sonia Chendak, the vice president for development and marketing for the museum. I don't know what to say. The Doge wall shows that it canceled more than 1,000 IMLS grants to local museums, libraries, and history centers. States and the American Library Association sued, and courts required the grants to be reinstated. The Baltimore Museum later received most of its funds. And on December 3rd, IMLS announced it was reinstating all grants. But those grants still appear as cuts on the Doge website, collectively saving the government about $134 million. People who track grants say Doge wasted money in another way, by halting research projects at a stage that rendered the government's previous investments useless. If you do all the hard work of collecting the data and then terminate the grant before you can publish the results, you just waste time and effort, said Scott Delaney, whose project Grant Witness has tracked thousands of scientific research grants that were canceled or frozen this year. In still other cases, Doge claimed credit for canceling projects it never touched. Margot Sawyer, an artist based in Texas, had a contract with the General Services Administration in which she was designing an architectural sculpture of hand-painted glass for a federal courthouse in Salt Lake City. But on January 2nd this year, she told the government that she wanted to end the work because of unforeseen costs tied to the outdoor site. In government records, her contract was canceled by mutual agreement, with about $245,000 de-obligated from it. Then, this summer, it appeared among Doge's savings claims. It's heart-wrenching when people are gleefully, happily like, oh, we canceled an art project, Miss Sawyer said. But the basic facts were wrong too. Ultimately, she said, she was the one who ended things. DeSantis' push is making over liberal college. Sarasota. April Flacken strides into the classroom to teach a course on the Odyssey, a new requirement at New College of Florida. She has taught philosophy at the small state college for 25 years. But this class is different. 7 weeks on one classic book required of all students. Normally, her focus is on philosophers like Hannah Arendt and Simone de Beauvoir, and their theories of totalitarianism, revolution, and feminism. This class on Homer is a turnabout from all that, and marks a signature accomplishment for conservatives who want to redirect higher education. In early 2023, Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican, executed what many viewed as a conservative takeover of New College, a struggling state school. With fewer than 1,000 students, the liberal arts college had long been a draw for nonconformists, where grades were verboten and students designed their own classes and majors. It was a little club med for people who were all ideologically the same, said Richard Corcoran, the school's new president. Under a new board and president, and as required by a new state law, the school has installed a curriculum emphasizing the traditional Western canon, with the Odyssey serving as a foundational text. It has created a new team for sports like baseball, basketball, and beach volleyball, and recruited athletes to fill out their rosters. It has hired dozens of new professors, some with conservative backgrounds, and a few who are known for their vocal opposition to liberal orthodoxies, like Spencer Clavin, a lecturer at this college last year, and host of the Young Heretics podcast about classical education. In September, it announced that a statue of Charlie Kirk, the assassinated conservative activist, would be placed on campus. And the college was among the first to say it would sign the Trump administration's compact for academic excellence in higher education, which links preferential access to federal funding to a willingness to adhere to federal policies and demands, and which better-known schools have scorned. The school has also shed DEI initiatives and gender studies. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. About 20 faculty members and 200 students decamped within the first 6 months of the makeover, according to the college. Today, the campus culture reflects the new influx of many conservative-leaning professors and students, who are sharing classes with the old guard, who tend to be more liberal. The conservative tilt is unusual for colleges with a liberal arts curriculum. The changes are not about imposing one point of view on education, Mr. Corcoran said, but about creating a place that values debate. But as the college continues to move toward the ideological right, Dr. Flackney and other longtime colleagues are reserving judgment. While she has embraced her class on the Odyssey, she wondered whether in the future there will be room for people like her at the college. She said that she can't help but feel that her fate at New College may depend more than ever on politics, especially now that the Trump administration has applied the full force of the federal government against the higher education establishment. I'd be happy to live out the rest of my career here, Dr. Flackney, 59, said. But people don't know which ways the political winds may blow. New College was founded in 1960 as a private, progressive school along the same lines as Hampshire College, an experimental school in Massachusetts that has also struggled to stay afloat. The founders wanted to free both students and faculty from the limits of lockstep curriculum and a focus on credit hours and a GPA, according to a history on the college website. The campus straddles two sides of a highway, with stunning views of Sarasota Bay, a setting that might do Club Med proud. At the school's dedication, the founders mixed dirt from Harvard and New College to symbolize their higher aspirations. It joined the state university system in 1975 and eventually received a state designation as an independent honors college. Mr. Corcoran said that his detractors have painted an unrealistically rosy portrait of New College before the shakeup. Enrollment was flagging. The dormitories designed by I.M. Pei were covered in mold. The bayfront grounds and the campus's Gatsby-esque mansions were shabby from years of neglect. His renewal plan consists, to a large degree, of things that any turnaround agent might have done, like recruiting student athletes and rehabbing buildings. But he has also poked at liberal sensibilities, for instance, by eliminating all gender bathrooms for trans students. And the college, along with other state universities, signed an agreement authorizing campus police to collaborate with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to enforce federal immigration rules. Commencement has become a decidedly more conservative affair. In 2023, the commencement speaker was Scott Atlas, the former Stanford physician and advisor in the first Trump administration, who defended his opposition to lockdowns and school closings to fight the coronavirus. In May, Alan Dershowitz, the contrarian Harvard law professor emeritus, took to the podium. David Mickix, a newly hired English professor and writer for Tablet, the Jewish-oriented news and ideas magazine, says the ideological rift at New College has been exaggerated. Some of my colleagues list their pronouns, others don't, he said. It hasn't been my experience that there is a sort of war between one side and another side. I don't even know what the sides would be, to tell you the truth. He said he is apolitical in the classroom. Asked to describe his politics, he said, "I'm kind of a centrist, with impulses in both directions." Some of Dr. Flackney's old colleagues grumble about the Odyssey and say that students would rather read a book that would be more relevant to their lives. Why, they ask, teach a 3,000-year-old book? I hate that many of the students in the Odyssey don't want to be there, Dr. Flackney said of her course. But she added that she understands the desire to provide a common and cross-generational experience to students. She said she finds the Odyssey to be super approachable for first-year students, as it raises questions about adventure, fathers and sons, marriage, and identity. It's a foundational book, she said, springing to her bookshelf and grabbing some evidence. Homerus, Derek Walcott's retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey, transposed to the Caribbean. And somewhat to her surprise, Dr. Flackney noted, no one has stopped her from continuing to teach about Simone de Beauvoir, even with the elimination of gender studies. I teach what I want to teach, because I feel able to justify it on intellectual grounds, she said. I will take the consequences if there were some. The college is growing. There are over 900 students this year from under 700 in 2022, according to the college. The acceptance rate of 73% is not particularly selective, but the college's provost, David Rohrbacher, said students are self-selecting before they apply. The college wants to maintain a ratio of about one teacher for every 8 students, a selling point. Tuition and fees are relatively low at $6,916 in-state and $29,944 for out-of-state students, according to U.S. News and World Report. A walk across campus in late November finds students clustered in 2 groups, reflecting the campus, pre- and post-makeover. The artsier contingent of students are known on campus as Novos, Latin for the new in the new college. The jocks are called Banyans, after the mighty banyan tree, the recently adopted school mascot. The old mascot consisted of 2 brackets known as the null set, which captured the meta-humor of the old guard. Lately, students say a new term has been circulating that conveys the school's evolving identity, NARPS, for non-athletic regular person. Many Novos types, like Callie Fleming, a transgender 4th-year student, had thought about leaving with the DeSantis overhaul. Hampshire College, a private school with a similar alternative vibe, had offered to take them in and match their lower tuition. About 3 dozen students accepted the offer that fall. Miss Fleming is glad she did not. She still feels safe at New College, at least as safe as anywhere else in society, she said. Most of the community that I like about New College is still here, she said. But she is a senior and perhaps among the last of the Novos. State investment has helped stabilize the school. Critics have attacked New College for extravagant spending, about $83,000 per student in 2024, the highest among state universities. But New College officials defend this as largely a one-time investment to improve infrastructure after years of deferred maintenance. As the school grows to its goal of 1,800 students, they say, there will be economies of scale. The administration has used some of the money to hire. There are currently 125 permanent and temporary faculty members, up from 105 in January of 2023, according to Jamie Miller, a spokesman for the college. About half of them, many with Ivy League degrees, have been hired since the shakeup, he said. As the new incarnation takes hold, several veteran professors, who asked not to be named because they wanted to protect their jobs, said the college's quirky identity is on the way out. But the demand for what the old New College had to offer just wasn't there, Mr. Corcoran said. Prospective students may not care for Homer either, but some may want to play on the new beach volleyball team. The players are from not only Florida, but Ohio, Brazil, Italy, and Spain. They were wooed with scholarships to play on sand that is fluffed twice a week, with the view of students kayaking on the bay. One member of the team, Liv Fenstermaker from Columbus, Ohio, said she was raised in a very old-school family and educated in Christian private schools. But she does not see ideological divisions on campus. I think everybody minds their own business, does their own thing. After felons are cleared by Uber, passengers accuse them of rape. Uber says its background checks are essential for keeping passengers safe, promising that all of its drivers have passed a screening for violent crimes. The claim, made in marketing materials, ignores a critical detail. The system approves people with many types of criminal convictions, including violent felonies. That is because Uber has limited the criteria used to vet potential drivers, part of a push to speed them onto the ride-hailing network while keeping costs down, a New York Times investigation found. Uber rejects prospective drivers who have been convicted of murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and terrorism. But in 22 states, the Times found, the company approves people convicted of most other crimes, including child abuse, assault, and stalking, so long as the convictions are at least 7 years old. There are also gaps in Uber's screenings. Background checks in 35 states are based on where a person has lived in the past 7 years. The result is that a crime that happened elsewhere could go unnoticed. Over time, company executives considered and ultimately chose not to expand the types of offenses they would disqualify someone according to internal documents reviewed by the Times. They also debated how thoroughly to look back for convictions. We are definitely not doing everything we can, Brooke Anderson, then Uber's head of safety communications, said in a 2018 email exchange about the background checks. One brainstorming document listed nearly 24 safety measures the company could adopt. In-person interviews were deemed logistically challenging, the document shows. Fingerprint checks were considered costly and time-intensive. Women who reported being sexually assaulted during Uber rides said that the company's vetting practices put them in harm's way. Accusations reflected in lawsuits and other court records reviewed by the Times. In 2020, an Uber driver in San Diego was accused of using his fingers to forcibly penetrate a passenger's vagina, then choking her and throwing her phone out the window when she tried to fight back. The driver's record included felony convictions for assault with a deadly weapon in 2002 and 2006. Earlier in 2020, he had been arrested after an allegation of rape, but not yet charged. Arrests alone are not disqualifying in Uber's background checks. The next year, an Uber driver in Tampa, Florida, was accused of raping a passenger who had been out celebrating her 21st birthday. The driver had 8 felony convictions, including for robbery with a firearm in 2002, as well as more than a dozen driving violations. And in the years since, drivers with convictions for assault, child abuse, armed robbery, and other crimes have been accused of sexually assaulting passengers across the country, the Times found. The incidents are part of a scourge of sexual violence during Uber rides. The ride-hailing giant received a report of sexual assault or sexual misconduct in the United States almost every 8 minutes, on average from 2017 to 2024, according to internal data revealed in litigation, far more than what the company has publicly disclosed. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It is unclear how many people with violent criminal histories have been cleared to drive for Uber, let alone how many of those drivers have sexually assaulted passengers. In one of the most comprehensive audits to date, officials in Massachusetts conducted background checks of ride-hailing drivers in the state in 2017, as new regulations were set to take effect that introduced stricter guidelines for screenings. Officials banned more than 8,000 drivers, or roughly 11%, who had previously been approved. Inside the company, executives have long been aware of the pervasiveness of sexual violence during rides and the risk of factors linked to attacks. Yet, they have repeatedly given priority to expanding their business over introducing stronger protections for drivers and passengers, a Times investigation in August found. As Uber grew into a $165 billion global behemoth, it successfully lobbied against laws proposed in many states that would have required stricter screenings. A key element of that campaign was positioning itself with criminal justice reform groups, previously unreported internal documents show. In a statement, Hannah Niles, Uber's head of safety for the Americas, said that the company believes a 7-year cutoff for felony convictions strikes the right balance between protecting public safety and giving people with older criminal records a chance to work and rebuild their lives. She said that the time period is grounded in academic research that has found that 7 years after an arrest, the likelihood that a person will commit another offense is as low as a person who never committed a crime. A lifetime exclusion for every criminal offense would unfairly prevent people from finding jobs long after they've served their time, she said. Because sexual violence is a significantly underreported crime, public safety experts, lawmakers, and others said that ride-hailing companies should do more to scrutinize and train drivers, who are often alone in cars with strangers. That could include in-person interviews and reference checks, as well as more education about sexual assault, consent, and a driver's duty to transport people safely, they said. They should hold their drivers to a high standard, knowing they are putting them in situations with vulnerable people who trust them and trust that Uber has checked them, said Aaron Murphy, a prosecutor in Boston who handles sexual assault cases involving ride-hailing drivers. The safety experts pointed to other jobs where people with violent felony convictions are often prohibited, such as employment in daycare centers, schools, and elder care facilities. Research shows that perpetrators of rape often have criminal histories, with the Justice Department study finding that more than a third of people arrested on rape charges had at least one prior felony conviction. Ms. Niles disputed the idea that driving for Uber is similar to working in a daycare or elder care facility. Fingerprint checks are inaccurate, ineffective, and discriminatory, she added, and in-person interviews likely would cause meaningful bias. Lyft, Uber's smaller rival, follows different guidelines. The company bans drivers with convictions for violent felonies, regardless of when they occurred. They result in lifetime bans from our platform, Amina Gill, Lyft's vice president for safety and customer care, said in a statement. Still, drivers with criminal records have slipped through Lyft's screenings. In March of 2019, a woman in Fresno, California, said her Lyft driver raped her after she requested a ride from a bar. Court records show the driver had multiple felony convictions from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, including for firing a shotgun at a vehicle while two people were inside. The woman sued the company, and the case was recently settled. Ms. Gill declined to comment about whether there were mistakes with the driver's screening. If Lyft becomes aware of a driver on the platform with such a conviction, that driver is immediately deactivated, she said. Uber and Lyft are now facing thousands of sexual assault lawsuits from passengers across the country. The companies maintain that rides are overwhelmingly safe and that the vast majority, at least 99.9% of or more than 1 billion rides in the United States a year, happen without incident. Uber said that 75% of the reports it had received about sexual assault and sexual misconduct were for less serious matters, such as flirting or making comments about someone's appearance. Safety is not a static goal, said Ms. Gill of Lyft. We're committed to continuously strengthening our systems and working with safety experts, advocates, and regulators to set the high standards for our industry. Ms. Nils, Uber safety executive, said the company's background checks were thorough, accurate, fair, and meet or exceed both the law and the practices of peer companies. She said that the company has invested in rerunning background checks for drivers each year and creating technologies to continuously monitor and flag new criminal offenses. We are confident when we say Uber is one of the safest ways to get around, Ms. Nils added. The woman in San Diego, who accused her driver of attacking her in 2020, said she had epilepsy and relied on Uber to get around because she saw promotions from the company that said safety was a top priority. In her case, the screening process did not flag a conviction that, according to California regulations, would normally disqualify a driver. The driver had previously been convicted of felonies in 2002 and 2006 for assault with a deadly weapon, with the 2002 incident classified as a violent offense for inflicting great bodily injury, according to court records. In California, people with violent felonies are permanently disqualified from driving for ride-hailing companies. Ms. Nils said the felony assault convictions had been reported to Uber by Checkr, the background check company that it uses to conduct screenings. But, she said, the classification as a violent offense had not. Uber's role is to correctly adjudicate the report we receive, which we did in this case, Ms. Nils said. Checkr declined to comment on the specifics of the screening, citing privacy laws. Uber blocked the driver's account in October of 2020 after receiving a report about the incident. He was later charged with forcible sexual penetration and robbery. He is now in prison for convictions related to this and another incident. I am naive for putting my trust in a corporation, the woman said. Can you blame me for listening to what they want me to believe?
When someone applies to drive for Uber, Checker cross-references their name, date of birth, social security number, and other details against public court documents, motor vehicle records, national criminal databases, and other sources. Uber customized the rules that Checker uses to review and report criminal records, including how far back to check for offenses, according to Uber's agreement with Checker. While specific guidelines vary according to state and local laws, Uber generally allows convictions after 7 years for any felony, including violent crimes. People can be blocked for pending charges. In a statement, Checker said that laws require the company to follow rigorous standards for accuracy and restrict the type of information that can appear on a background check. Reports fall into 2 categories: clear or consider. A team at Uber reviews reports in the consider category, Ms. Nils said. She added that a background check, on average, takes 3 days. But if a screening is clear, court records show the entire process can finish in a matter of hours, without an Uber employee ever meeting an applicant. In 2022, Uber approved a driver in Florida who was on parole after a decade in prison for 2 violent felonies. About 1 month after the driver began with Uber, court records show a passenger accused him of sexual misconduct. Less than a week later, another reported him to the police for rape. The driver denied the accusation, saying the sex was consensual. In March of 2024, a woman said her Uber driver forcibly groped and digitally penetrated her in a parking lot in the Atlanta area. The driver's record included a conviction for child abuse with an 18-year prison sentence after 3 teenagers had accused him of sexual assault, court records show. In December 2024, a driver picked up Caitlin Woodworth, then a 29-year-old mother of 2 in Oregon who had been out drinking. Instead of taking her home, she told the police that he raped her. Uber had cleared the driver despite a 2012 conviction for felony assault. At a criminal trial in late October, the driver pleaded not guilty to kidnapping, rape, and sodomy charges, saying that the sex was consensual. In a ruling after a bench trial, the judge acquitted the driver, saying that prosecutors had failed to prove that Miss Woodworth was legally incapacitated at the time of the incident, or that the driver knew she was incapable of consent. Ms. Nils said that all 3 drivers were screened correctly and in accordance with state laws. Ms. Woodworth has sued Uber for negligence. The company said in court filings that it was not responsible for the incident. "You had all of the red flags," she said. "You had all of the information you needed to protect me." She said that the incident has left her suffering from night terrors and insomnia, leading her to stop working and abandon creative pursuits like painting. She said she holds in panic attacks when her sons, who know that mommy got hurt, give her a hug. She now sits alone in silence after she puts them to bed. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Sunday, December 28th, 2025 issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Julian Wong. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that, at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,